By late 1944, the German Luftwaffe was bleeding, but it was not dead. In fact, it was fielding some of the most dangerous aircraft it had ever produced. The legendary Focke-Wulf FW-190, the Butcher Bird, had evolved. The early radial engine versions were deadly, but they lost power at high altitude. To counter the Allied bomber streams, Kurt Tank, the brilliant German designer, created the FW-190D9. The Dora. They lengthened the nose. They installed a powerful Junkers Jumo liquid-cooled engine. They added methanol water injection, MW50, to boost speed. The result was a masterpiece. The Dora was fast, over 420 miles per hour. It climbed like a rocket. It had a lethal mix of cannons and machine guns. The German aces who flew the Dora, men like Hans Dortemann, believed they had regained technological parity with the Allies. They respected the Pe-51 Mustang, but they didn't fear it. In a Dora, a skilled German pilot could dive away from a Mustang. He could outroll a Spitfire. The Luftwaffe pilots regained a swagger that had been missing since 1942. They patrolled the skies over northwestern Germany, protecting the jet airfields of the Me-262. They believed that down low, on the deck, they were the kings of speed. They watched the skies for the familiar shapes of Mustangs and Spitfires. They weren't looking for the shape that was about to kill them. A shape with a massive chin radiator, clipped wings, and a sound that sounded like a tearing canvas. The British had built a brute. And it was coming for the Dora. To understand the Tempest, you have to understand the failure of its father, the Typhoon. Sidney Cam, the legendary designer at Hawker Aviation, had built the Typhoon to be the ultimate interceptor. It failed. It had a thick wing that created too much drag. It vibrated. It was dangerous. It found a second life as a ground attack plane, as we saw in a previous story, but Cam wasn't satisfied. He wanted to build the fastest fighter in the world. He begged the Air Ministry for another chance. He went back to the drawing board. He looked at the Typhoon and identified the flaw, the wing. It was too thick. So, Cam designed a new wing. It was much thinner. It was semi-elliptical. But thinning the wing created a massive problem. In the Typhoon, the fuel tanks were inside the thick wings. In the new design, there was no room for fuel in the wings. Cam had to move the fuel tanks into the fuselage, in front of the cockpit. This meant lengthening the nose of the plane to balance the weight. The result was the Hawker Tempest V. It looked like a Typhoon that had gone to the gym and lost 50 pounds. It was sleeker, longer, meaner. The Air Ministry was skeptical. They remembered the disaster of the early Typhoon, the tails falling off, the carbon monoxide leaks. They hesitated to order this new machine. But Cam was relentless. He knew that the laws of aerodynamics were on his side. He knew that if he could make this new, thin wing to the monstrous Napier Sabre engine, he would create a plane that defied the speed limits of 1944. He wasn't building a dogfighter. He was building a hot rod. The heart of the Tempest was the Napier Sabre II engine. It was a mechanical nightmare, but it was also a miracle of power. Most aircraft engines were V12s, like the Merlin, or radials, like the P-47. The Sabre was an H-24. Imagine two 12-cylinder engines stacked on top of each other, geared together to drive a single propeller. It had 24 cylinders. It used sleeve valves instead of poppet valves. It was incredibly compact, dense, and heavy. And it produced over 2,200 horsepower. With emergency boost, it could push 2,400. When a Tempest pilot started the engine, it didn't rumble like a radial. It screamed. The exhaust note was high-pitched, metallic, and terrifying. The German pilots knew the sound of a Merlin. They knew the sound of a radial. But the sound of a Sabre was something new. It sounded like a piece of heavy machinery tearing the sky apart. The engine gave the Tempest VA top speed of 435 miles per hour at relatively low altitudes. This was the key. Most fighters, like the P-51 and the Bf-109, were optimized for high altitude, 25,000 feet. The Tempest was optimized for medium to low altitude. Down on the deck, below 5,000 feet, the Tempest was the fastest thing with a propeller. The German FW-190D9 was fast, but down low, the Tempest was faster. The German pilots relied on their speed to escape trouble. They didn't know that the British had built a machine that could run them down in a straight line. The Napier Sabre was temperamental. It required constant maintenance. It leaked oil. But for the pilot strapped into the cockpit, it provided a sensation of limitless power. When they pushed the throttle forward, the acceleration pushed them back into the seat and held them there. The secret weapon of the Tempest wasn't a gun, it was the shape of its wing. Sidney Cam had utilized a new aerodynamic concept, laminar flow. In a traditional wing, like the Spitfire or Typhoon, the thickest part of the wing is near the front, the leading edge. As air flows over the wing, it becomes turbulent quickly, creating drag. In a laminar flow wing, like the P-51 Mustang and the Tempest, the thickest part of the wing is moved further back. This keeps the air flowing smoothly over the wing surface for much longer before it breaks up into turbulence. Less turbulence means less drag. Less drag means more speed. The Tempest wing was also clipped, it didn't have rounded tips. This improved the roll rate at low altitudes. But this thin wing came with a cost. It had a very high stall speed. Landing a Tempest was terrifying. The pilot had to come in fast, over 100 miles per hour. If he slowed down too much, the thin wings would lose lift instantly, and the 7-ton plane would drop like a stone. It required a skilled pilot. It was not a forgiving plane like the Spitfire. But in the air, at combat speeds, the wing was a revelation. It allowed the Tempest to dive at speeds approaching the sound barrier without shaking apart. It allowed it to maintain its energy in a turn. The German engineers had studied laminar flow, but they hadn't implemented it fully on the FW-190. They stuck to more traditional designs. This gave the British a crucial aerodynamic edge. The Tempest could slice through the air with a clean efficiency that the rugged FW-190 couldn't match. The Luftwaffe aces looked at the Tempest and saw a big, heavy brute. They didn't see the subtle curve of the wing that allowed the brute to dance. They were about to learn that aerodynamics is a harsh mistress, and she was on the side of the Royal Air Force. Before the Tempest could hunt the Dora, it had to save London. In June 1944, the Germans unleashed the V-1 flying bomb. The Doodlebug. It was a cruise missile powered by a pulse jet engine. It flew at 2,000 feet, straight and level, at speeds between 350 and 400 miles per hour. Most Allied fighters couldn't catch it. The Spitfire Mk9 was too slow at that altitude. The Mustang was fast, but took time to wind up. The Tempest V was the only machine ready for the job. The V1 flew on the deck, exactly where the Napier Sabre engine performed best. Tempest Wing 150, led by the legendary Roland Beaumont, was assigned to the diver patrols. The tactic was terrifying. A Tempest pilot would spot the flame of the V1's exhaust. He would push his throttle past the gate, emergency power. The engine would scream at plus 11 pounds of boost. The Tempest would shudder as it pushed past 420 miles per hour. Closing the distance was a math problem with lethal consequences. If you shot the V1 from close range, 200 yards, the massive warhead, 1,800 pounds of amatol, would explode. The explosion would engulf the Tempest. Many pilots flew through the fireball and came out with their fabric control surfaces burned off or their engines choked with debris. So, they developed a new method. A method that required nerves of steel and supreme confidence in the airframe. The wing tip. The Tempest pilot would fly alongside the V1, matching its speed exactly. 400 miles per hour. Wingtip to wingtip. He would inch closer until his wing was underneath the wing of the bomb. Then, he would flick his stick to the side. The airflow over the Tempest's wing would disrupt the air under the V1's wing. The V1, which relied on simple gyroscopes for stability, would be flipped over. Its guidance system would tumble. The engine would stall or the bomb would simply dive into the English countryside, miles short of London. It was a maneuver that required the precision of a surgeon performed at the speed of a race car. Only the Tempest had the low-altitude stability and raw power to do it consistently. The Tempest force destroyed 638 V1s. The German engineers who built the V1 thought it was too fast to be intercepted. They hadn't counted on a plane that was essentially a manned missile itself. This campaign honed the Tempest pilots. They learned to fly fast, low, and aggressively. They were warming up for the Luftwaffe. By late 1944, the V1 threat had receded. The Tempest wings were moved to the continent. They were stationed at forward airfields in Holland and Germany, sometimes just miles from the front. Their mission changed. They were no longer defenders. They were hunters. The mission profile was called the Rat Scramble. German jets, the Me-262 and the Arado 234, were operating from airfields like Rain and Vaucluse. The jets were faster than the Tempests at altitude. But they were vulnerable when taking off and landing. The Tempest pilots sat in their cockpits on the runway, engines warmed up, waiting for the radio call. Scramble. Rats active. The Sabres roared. The Tempests launched. They didn't climb. They stayed low. Incredibly low. They flew at 0 feet, skimming the Dutch canals and German hedgerows at 450 miles per hour. This was the Tempest's kingdom. Down here, the air was thick. A Mustang or a Spitfire would be buffeted by turbulence. The Tempest, with its high wing loading and stiff structure, cut through the turbulence like a train on rails. It was a stable gun platform even at treetop height. They would race toward the German airfields, hoping to catch the jets in the landing pattern. But often, they ran into the German piston fighters protecting the jets. The FW-190 Doras. The rat scramble turned into a vicious, low-level brawl. There was no room for vertical maneuvers. If you dove, you hit the ground. It was a drag race with guns. The German pilots, taking off in their Doras, would look around and see these massive, shark-mouthed British fighters closing on them at impossible speeds. The German flak, that flak alley leading to the jet bases, was intense. The Tempest pilots flew through walls of 20 mm and 37 mm fire. The plane was rugged. It could take hits that would crumple a Mustang. The rat scramble was the most dangerous game of the air war. It required split-second reflexes. But it terrified the Luftwaffe. They realized that their airfields were no longer sanctuaries. The Tempest had the speed to cross the front line, penetrate deep into Germany, kill a plane on the runway, and outrun the flak on the way home. The rats had nowhere to hide. The confrontation between the FW-190D-9 Dora and the Tempest V was the heavyweight title fight of the piston era. Both were the pinnacles of their respective nations' engineering. The Dora pilot relied on one specific maneuver to escape Allied fighters, the dive. The FW-190 had a phenomenal roll rate. If a Spitfire got on his tail, the German pilot would roll upside down and pull hard. He would dive vertically. Most Allied planes couldn't follow. The Spitfire's controls stiffened. The Mustang wobbled. The Dora pilot would zoom away, leaving the enemy behind. In early 1945, a flight of Doras from JG-26 bounced a flight of Tempests. After the initial pass, a Dora pilot found a Tempest on his tail. He did what he always did. He rolled and dove. He pushed the nose down, watching his airspeed indicator climb. 400, 450. 500 kilometers per hour. He looked back, expecting to see the British plane fading into a small dot. Instead, the Tempest was bigger. The Tempest's laminar flow wing loved speed. It loved the dive. Unlike the Spitfire, the Tempest didn't suffer from compressibility issues until it hit much higher speeds. And the heavy Napier Sabre engine acted like a lead weight, dragging the plane down with terrifying acceleration. The German pilot panicked. He pushed his engine to emergency power. It didn't matter. The Tempest was closing. The British pilot didn't have to worry about his wings ripping off. He didn't have to worry about his controls locking. He just kept the nose down. At 450 miles per hour, the Tempest was rock steady. The British pilot lined up the Dora in his gyroscopic gun sight. He fired a short burst. The 420mm Hispano cannons shredded the Dora. This scene played out again and again over Germany. The German aces realized with horror that their escape card had been revoked. They couldn't outdive the Tempest. They couldn't outrun it at low altitude. Their only chance was to drag the fight up high, above 20,000 feet, where the Tempest's thick wing, relatively, and heavy engine struggled. But the Tempest pilots were smart. They refused to climb. They stayed low, dragging the Germans down into the mud, down into the thick air where the Sabre engine was king. The Dora was a magnificent machine, but it had met a monster that simply ignored the laws of physics that constrained other planes. The most famous chronicler of the Tempest's dominance was a Frenchman, Pierre Clostermann. An ace with the Free French Air Force flying for the RAF, Clostermann was a student of air combat. He flew a Tempest V-coded JFE, which he named Le Grand Charles, after de Gaulle. His memoir, The Big Show, paints a vivid picture of what it felt like to fly the beast. He described the Tempest as a brute. It was heavy on the controls. It was exhausting to fly. The cockpit was hot, noisy, and smelled of oil and cordite. But he loved it. He wrote about the confidence it gave him. It was a machine that flattered your pilot's vanity, he wrote. He knew that when he pushed the throttle, he had more power at his fingertips than any other pilot in the sky. Clostermann's accounts of dogfights with FW-190s and Me-109s are harrowing. He describes engaging a formation of FW-190s near the Rhine. He used the Tempest's speed to slash through the formation, firing snap shots with his cannons. He didn't try to turn with them. He used the boom and zoom tactic refined to its absolute limit. He describes the devastating power of the Hispano cannons. A single shell hit a Focke-Wulf and the whole aircraft seemed to explode. But he also describes the danger. The Tempest's engine was fragile. If the radiator was hit, the engine would seize in seconds. Clostermann had to make several forced landings. But the airframe was tough. He survived crashes that would have killed him in a Spitfire. Through Clostermann's eyes, we see the Tempest not just as a machine, but as a personality. It was aggressive. It was unforgiving. It demanded a pilot who was physically strong and mentally sharp. But if you mastered it, as Clostermann did, you were the king of the air. He ended the war as one of the top Allied aces, and he credited his survival to the speed of Le Grand Charles. The French ace and his British machine became the ultimate symbol of the Allied victory in the air, a cosmopolitan coalition wielding overwhelming industrial power. By 1945, the German Luftwaffe had played its final card, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. It was a marvel of technology. It could fly at 540 miles per hour. No piston fighter could catch it in level flight. But the Tempest pilots found its weakness. The early jet engines were fragile. They had poor throttle response. If a pilot slammed the throttle forward, the engines would flame out or catch fire. This meant that when a Me-262 was landing or taking off, it was slow and vulnerable. The Tempest pilots became jet hunters. They would patrol high above the German jet bases at Rhein and Alkmaar. They would wait in the clouds, watching the concrete runways. When they saw the dust kick up from a jet taking off, or the glint of a canopy on final approach, they would strike. The Tempest was the perfect machine for this ambush. Its high diving speed allowed it to drop from the clouds like a stone. Its stability allowed the pilot to aim accurately in a high-speed dive. Imagine the terror of a German jet pilot. He is coming in to land. His fuel is low. He has to fly slow and straight. Suddenly, his rearview mirror is filled with the massive, radiator-jawed face of a Tempest. He tries to accelerate, but his engines won't respond fast enough. The Tempest pilot opens fire. The jet disintegrates on the runway. This tactic, the rat scramble, neutralized the technological advantage of the jet. The Germans were furious. They surrounded their airfields with chaflak alleys of hundreds of 20mm and 37mm guns to protect the jets. But the Tempest pilots flew through the flak. They accepted the risk. They knew that killing a jet on the ground was just as good as killing it in the air. The Tempest was the only Allied fighter fast enough to even attempt this game. A Spitfire couldn't dive fast enough. A Mustang took too long to accelerate. The Tempest was a bully. And it bullied the jets into submission. The Tempest didn't just rely on speed. It carried a knockout punch. While the Americans relied on the .50 caliber machine gun, a kinetic weapon, the British relied on the 20mm Hispano cannon. The Tempest V carried 4 Hispano MKV cannons buried in its thin wings. The MKV was a shortened, lighter version of the famous gun. It had a faster rate of fire. When a Tempest pilot pulled the trigger, he wasn't firing bullets. He was firing high-explosive shells. A single 20mm shell hitting a German fighter would blow a hole the size of a dinner plate. It would sever wing spars. It would explode fuel tanks. Against locomotives, the effect was devastating. The Tempest became the scourge of the German rail network. Pilots would line up on a train. They would fire a short burst. The locomotive boiler would explode in a massive cloud of steam and steel. The Hispano punch meant that the Tempest didn't have to stay on target for long. A snapshot, a split-second burst during a high-speed pass, was often enough to destroy the enemy. This suited the Tempest's flying style perfectly. It was a slash-and-dash fighter. The muzzle flash of the 4 cannons was blinding, especially at night. The recoil slowed the plane down. But the destructive power was absolute. German pilots who survived encounters with .50 caliber fire often limped home with holes in their wings. German pilots hit by 20mm fire usually walked home, if they had a parachute. The Tempest was a flying artillery battery, delivering explosive death at 400 miles per hour. In the final weeks of the war, the Luftwaffe collapsed. German planes were grounded due to lack of fuel. They were parked in the open or hidden under trees at the edge of airfields. The Tempest wings were unleashed to finish them off. This was the airfield turkey shoot. Tempest squadrons roamed deep into Germany, looking for targets of opportunity. They found airfields packed with aircraft that couldn't fly. The Tempests would form a Catherine wheel attack. One section would dive and strafe, destroying the parked planes. As they pulled up, the next section would dive. It was a relentless cycle of destruction. Ju-88s, He-111s, and FW-190s burned on the ground. It was dangerous work. The German light flak was still active and deadly. Many Tempest pilots were shot down during these strafing runs, killed by a lucky shot from a 20mm gunner defending his airfield. But the results were catastrophic for Germany. In a single day, a Tempest wing could destroy 50 or 60 German aircraft. They destroyed the Luftwaffe on the ground because the Luftwaffe refused to come up and fight. The German ground crews watched helplessly as their precious machines were turned into scrap metal by the British fighters screaming overhead at treetop height. The sound of the Sabre engine became the soundtrack of the German defeat. It was the sound of total air superiority. The Tempest had started as an interceptor, become a robot killer, V-1S, and ended the war as the ultimate ground attack predator. It cleaned up the mess that the strategic bombers had left behind. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the Hawker Tempest V stood at the pinnacle of piston engine development. It was the fastest low-altitude fighter of the war. It had destroyed the V-1 threat. It had hunted the Me-262 jets. It had broken the back of the FW-190D-9 force. It was a pilot's airplane. Difficult, dangerous, but immensely rewarding. Its designer, Sidney Cam, had been vindicated. He had taken the flawed Typhoon and refined it into a masterpiece. The Tempest proved that brute force aerodynamics could work if you had enough power and the right wing shape. It was the bridge to the future. The Hawker Sea Fury, which fought in Korea, was a direct descendant of the Tempest. But the Tempest V was the one that mattered. It arrived when the Allies needed speed the most. The Luftwaffe aces had believed that their Doras and jets made them untouchable. They mocked the thick British planes. But the Tempest was a razor blade. It cut through their defenses, it cut through their speed advantage, and it cut through their hope. As the props stopped spinning on VE Day, the Tempest sat on the airfields of occupied Germany, steaming slightly, oil dripping from its cowling. It was an ugly, beautiful beast. And it was the undisputed king of the deck.